All right, so welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time joining us. I know that folks found the registration a little bit late, so they're joining us for day 2 of the Native Focused 40-hour sexual assault advocacy training. And today we're going to be covering sexual violence in Indian country with an oppression analysis. And we'll take a little break, and then we'll do the sex offender module, what advocates need to know. And that's kind of the day. If there's any questions, let me know. Of course, if you need to take a break, take a break. You know, if you need to go get some food or snacks or take a walk, you do what you have to do to take care of yourselves for sure, okay? A reminder about our 4 sacred elements. You know, it's always good to have some kind of water with you. So not only does water come into our bodies as our first medicine, but it's able to it's able to hold energy too, right? So it can just be a stabilizer, even if it's not going into your body. Just having it near you, it can be a stabilizer. Jen, the slides are definitely available to print off. I forgot to send them to Afton because I had an incredibly busy morning. If you give me a chance in a little while, I can, well, let's just do it. Hey man, we're in real time here. Let's just do it. I'm gonna email this module to you, Afton, and if you can drop it in the chat, that would be awesome.
Oh, for sure.
Normally I do that in the morning, but boy, today was a wild one. Because I know that sometimes people like to have things figured out. Okay, and I'll get the sex offender module to you during break. So yeah, our 4 sacred elements, whatever that looks like, to have that near you will be helpful. We're going to be talking about some pretty intense stuff today. It's just a way to keep our bodies and spirits and minds in balance, right? If you got to smudge up or light a candle, please do so. Today, we're going to be talking about federal policies, tactics of assimilation, tactics of genocide, colonialism. That's just the first part of the day, right? And the second half of the day is going to be talking about sex offenders. And, you know, many of us have experiences with sexual violence or experience with harm doers. Sometimes our harm doers can be in our own family or people that we love. And so it can be a complicated conversation. And so we just want to interrupt our habits around, you know, how we're kind of taking that information in and metabolizing it. If something comes up for you, you ask a question. If, you know, if you're curious about something, just bring it into the room. That's what this space is for. If you have expertise on something and want to share it, please do. Don't be afraid, right? We're all experts up in this room. We're experts in our own lives and have insight that may be helpful to somebody else. So let's bring it here and share with each other, okay? Be willing to look at some of the strategies and tactics that have been used to oppress people. And, you know, it can be uncomfortable a little bit. Just a reminder that as advocates, we stand in biased support of survivors. And we stand outside of those systems. We're going to challenge harmful practices. We're going to challenge if somebody is having internalized oppression showing up. For example, if you're working with somebody and they say, man, I just shouldn't have even gone there that night, right? Like that's a way to try to work the information out, but it's never their fault if somebody causes harm to them. It's that person's choice, right? So just making sure we're interrupting some of those things that may show up when we're working with folks, meeting them where they're at, wherever they're at, Not everybody has access to conversations like this, right? Sometimes we're really struggling. We're actively experiencing violence in our own lives, right? Some of us in this room here may be actively experiencing violence in our own lives. And wherever you are, that's a good place to be, right? So meeting folks where they're at, they may not have the fancy words or the fancy analysis, because we're all learning, right? Every day I'm learning. I learn something new every day, and I've been doing this for a while. Yeah. Standing outside those systems, making sure we're really thinking about how we're dismantling the conditions that got us here, that keep perpetuating a culture of violence. What does our advocacy look like to be dismantling the conditions, not just kind of putting band-aids on wounds, right? Carrying the stories of every survivor, every experience. Even if you haven't worked directly with somebody, you may have heard something that is like, I can't even believe that, right? And we can carry that in a basket, like a basket in our heart. When we're hearing experiences over and over again, then that usually means that there's some sort of change that needs to happen to respond better. And carrying those stories with us really matter. So first of all, let's find out who our people are. So who are your people? And your people can be anybody. You can be farmers, you can be vegetarians, you can be from a land base, whoever your people are. If it's not in this list here, you're welcome to type it in the chat. It's a multiple choice. So if you're Indigenous to multiple places, you can select multiple places. If there's folks who cannot see the chat because they're calling in, you're welcome to jump on the microphone and tell us who your people are, or type it in the chat. Eva's from Honduras. Angeline, are you going to jump on the mic? Maybe not. I'm going to mute you just in case it's an accident. Sometimes we accidentally unmute ourselves. All right, I'm going to end this poll and share it with y'all. You're still welcome to type it in the chat if you get back to your computer. So for this particular room of people, 39 of us are Indigenous to this continent. 2 of us are Indigenous to the South American continent. 1 is from the African continent. 4 are from the Asian continent. 12 are Indigenous to the European continent. No one from Australia here, and a couple of us are not sure. The Lakota and Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, and Dakota from Santee are in the house. It's awesome. So I'm going to stop sharing that. So I asked this question before we start this module because it's important for us to kind of, we're going to enter into a conversation about oppression and the tactics used to uphold oppression. And it can get a little, I don't know, a little sensitive, right? Because we're talking about a continent, the United States, or, if you think about Canada, the United States, and down south, it's all one landmass. We're all Indigenous to this body of land, but people are indigenous to wherever you're indigenous from. But there's also some realities about how people landed on this continent. Some were born here, some their ancestors have been here since time immemorial. Some were brought over here on the slave ships by force and violence. Some immigrated here. Some came here out of fear. Some came here out of hope and love and a desire for a different life. So there's many different reasons why people landed on this particular continent. But this is a native focused training, and we're trying to understand how all those intricacies impact native folks in real time, even today. And we got to dig in a little bit about that and kind of be honest about some of the things that have happened, right? And we'll just talk about it. So the goals and objectives, just kind of thinking about the root causes. You know, how do we restore wellness in our communities? And how do we make those connections to colonialism? You know, how does it show up in real time in our lives? So not only as sovereign nations, how does it impact us as sovereign nations, but how does it impact us in our families and our communities, right? I mean, one of the things that sometimes people don't know, and I know I didn't grow up learning this, is that, you know, there's like over 700 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and there's many, many, many hundreds that are not federally recognized because legislation or laws were passed to erase them. So the 700 plus tribes are ones who have fought to be recognized as a nation unto themselves. And we have a government to government relationship with the United States government. So just like any country, any country, they can enter into treaties with the United States. And so that's the tribal nations have the ability and have historically entered into treaties with the United States, right? So it's not this power over thing. It's a parallel power, but you would never know that based on how things function in real life, right? So just kind of understanding that a little bit, understanding how these federal policies have impacted our lives, right? And then, you know, how can our advocacy, oh yeah, no worries, no worries. No apologies needed. I mean, look at me, I was running around shutting off TVs and getting snacks for my nephew, so no worries, man, this is real life and we're all good. So thinking about how our advocacy is that critical component in making those changes. So not just in the lives of people experiencing violence, but at that other level too, that institutional level, that social level. What does that look like? So what we first need to identify, and we know this, but let's just review, you know, sexual assault is a crime. It's if a victim cannot or does not give enthusiastic consent. It can have elements of force, coercion, or manipulation, and in many different, along a spectrum of what that force, coercion, and manipulation looks like. And the motive is power and control, right? So there can be some, I don't know, you know, oftentimes people can think that sexual violence is about sex. And it, because of our human body, the biology of our human beingness, we have sex, our sex drive is a very powerful thing. And so it can get confused with, or, you know, when sex is being used as violence, it can be confused. If our bodies have such high, powerful sexual urges, to understand that, it can get confusing about whether it's about sex or whether it's about violence. And we want to just name very explicitly that using sex as violence, that's what it is. It's about power and control, not about sex. It can happen across all spectrums of life. It doesn't matter how old we are, what color our skin is, what our gender identity is, how much money we make, It doesn't matter how educated we are. It doesn't matter if we're doing this work for our entire lives, working to end sexual violence, it can still happen because it is, we're living in a culture of violence right now, right? Where it's used as a weapon, it's weaponized daily. We see it all over, everywhere around us, right? And so how is that possible? How is sexual violence possible? And why is it so deeply impactful in Native communities, right? Because some of the statistics are that 4 out of 5 American Indian or Alaska Native women and men have experienced violence in their lifetime. 1 in 4 for Native folks and 1 in 10 for non-Native folks, according to the surveys. Remember I was saying yesterday or whatever day that statistics sometimes can be, you have to take all of them with a grain of salt, but even 1 is too many, right? 1 person experiencing violence is too many. 85% of folks in the LGBTQ two-spirit community have experienced sexual assault. So if you line up 100 two-spirit folks, 85 of them potentially have experienced sexual assault. If you put 5 women, 5 Native women or 5 Native men in a room, 4 out of 5 of them have been sexually assaulted. So, you know, that's mind-blowing in and of itself, but why? How come? There's Hercules. Let's see. Let's make him co-host.
Hey, Christine, we do have a question. Do you know if that 85% is in general or specifically to American Indian people?
You know, I had that article pulled up and I cannot say with certainty whether it's generally or whether it's specific to Natives. I have the report in one of my documents, so I'll make a note and I'll pull that up and I'll share that with folks, okay?
Isaac, we'll get that to you. If you have an email, feel free to message one of us and we can send over that document too.
Yeah. I think that's a good idea to just post that document in the link that I'll share with the Google. You know, when I send the recording in that link and I attach all the PowerPoints and all the appendices, all the documents that go with it, I think it's important to add some of these reports in that so you have that as a resource as well. It's incredibly high though in the two-spirit community because of the, you know, homophobia as being one of the very core roots of oppression and one of the tactics to try to break the people, right? It's really high. So based on our population, you know, nationwide, we make up about 2.1% of the population. It kind of fluctuates a little bit. And then certain areas of the country have more population of Native folks than other places, right? For example, Oklahoma, California, Alaska, really high populations of Native folks, whereas in other states, it's not as much. So, but generally, we have the highest rates. If you were to look at the overall numbers, we have the highest rates based on our population. And so there's reasons for that, right? That's built into some of these conversations about our federal policies, some of the assimilation stuff that we'll be talking about here in a little while. So again, these statistics are, even 1 is too many, they're very high. It's just something to kind of just keep in the back of your mind. And there are folks asking the questions, but how honest are we when we're answering the questions? I always wonder who's coming into our communities to ask the questions and how are they proposing the information, right? We have a inherent mistrust of the systems because of what we have experienced as Native people. So first of all, you know, I have white skin. I present to the world in this skin. So, you know, I want to note that too, that that has shaped my life just by how I look and how I present in the world. So if you think about folks who have experienced being put onto reservations, if you think about all of the war and all of the policies and practices that have been put in place, being relocated, being put on reservations, all of these things impact our ability to trust. If you think about stealing our children and forcing them into boarding schools, right? There's just so many instances that we have been betrayed by the federal government that we have very little trust. So many times that we have been betrayed by institutions that are supposed to help people that we have very little trust, right? And so even when you're doing surveys like this, doing research and asking questions, it's just not known how many people are telling the full truth when they're asked these questions. But for me, these statistics mean that one is too many and we have to work against it. Right? Hercules, oh, very nice to see you. You have less hair. Yeah, less hair. Okay, so how does colonization work? You know, that's a big question. We're not going to have all the answers, but we're going to dig into a little bit. So this is Lord Macaulay's address to the British Parliament on February 2nd in 1835. And this is what he said to the Parliament. He said, I have traveled across the length and breadth of India, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral values, people of such caliber that I do not think that we would ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. And therefore, I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system, her culture. For if the Indians think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation. So this is in India. This isn't on this continent. And then I could pull up a few other examples of legislation that's been passed in other continents, right? So the tactics remain the same. They're tried and true tactics. For folks who may have heard of Machiavelli, if you haven't, Google it, get a library book, I don't know, but you will see that these tactics have been going on for thousands of years. And there's very specific tactics about divide and conquer, about using violence without consequences, about replacing the education system with, you know, a different way of thinking. And so, you know, we're just going to talk a little bit more this morning about what those tactics are. I mean, the fastest way to break the people is through their spirituality and their sexuality. They're our most sacred things, right? And so if you can interrupt our kinship and our teachings and our coming of age, our sense of purpose and place and role in the community, if you can interrupt those things and replace it with something else about hierarchy, about power, about you know, resource extraction, like what can you get out of the people in the place that you're at, that's how you can colonize a nation. Right? Tactics, very specific and intentional tactics. So by definition, well, I guess I just said all that. I don't have to say it again, right? Really specific tactics. And it comes with a sort of social component. Like you have to promote a set of beliefs that support something, right? I was laying in bed one night, and I remember somebody saying, "Oh, don't be so chintzy." And in my understanding, or in my region where I grew up, when you told somebody that they were being chintzy, that meant they were being stingy. Like, oh, don't be so stingy with your chips, right? Don't be so chintzy with your chips. And for some reason, it popped into my head, like, where did that even, chintzy, where did that even come from? And so, of course, I tried to go back to sleep. And I'm laying there, and all of a sudden, my eyes, like, they pop open, and I couldn't stand it. I had to get on my phone and Google it. And so and I'm just telling you this because it's such a demonstrable example of the power of legislation and law in our lives. So chintz is a fabric made out of cotton that originated in India. And so they used kind of like unfinished cotton, but they carved blocks on a piece of wood, intricate, beautiful patterns on a piece of wood. They dipped it in natural dyes, and then they laid it on that cotton in squares like this. And so it created these vibrant, beautiful textiles. So in India, everything's fine, but then this is when trade is starting to pick up. And as you know, in Europe, they're using primarily wool, or, the silk trade is happening, but wool is a major fabric for Europeans at this time. So when this influx of this chintz fabric started coming in, because they would see the fabric and say, it's so beautiful and so cheap, we want it to decorate our homes. And so England had to pass a law to say that it was illegal to import chintz into London or wherever it was. So that is just such a clear example to me of people in power seeing that they're going to lose money by importing this beautiful fabric that's helping these people make a living in their country, but they want to protect their own economy in their own place, right? So how the attaching factor to that is not only did they have to pass the law, but they had to make it, they had to have like a social, what do they call that? When you, oh my gosh, there's a word for it, folks. Help me with, they had to make it bad to want this chintz fabric in your home. Like, oh, that's so gaudy and low, stigmatized. There's another word for it. Oh my goodness, it's going to make me crazy. I think it starts with a P. The public. Oh, it's going to make me crazy.
Ostracize.
No. When you have to give misinformation to the public to justify what you're doing.
Propaganda.
Andrea, propaganda. Yes. So they had to create this whole propaganda that it was that you were just being tacky if you had this fabric. So then, of course, people stopped wanting the fabric, and then it became a non-issue. But that's what I'm saying, that promoting a set of beliefs is really important to uphold the oppressive tactic. Yeah. Lies. Yeah. Okay. So with that said, I want to stop my share, and I want to play this little video. And we'll watch about 8 minutes of it because it's going to talk about the doctrine of discovery. And I think it really demonstrates, we'll watch about 8 minutes of it, but it will say it way faster and way clearer than I could ever talk about the doctrine of discovery. And, some of the tactics that are from way back, way before this country was even populated by Europeans, and some of the thinking around it. Can you see White River Cheyenne Mennonite Church on your screen? I can't see my chat, so.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, we're gonna play about 8 minutes or so of this.
I grew up on the reservation, so my identity is I'm Northern Cheyenne, and my identity is complex because I got bussed off the reservation and went to a predominantly white school. And so I would come home and have Native culture, and then I would be bussed off and be immersed in dominant culture with English language. Come home, and my dad's first language is Cheyenne. I think my identities as a Mennonite and Northern Cheyenne, I think they always go back and forth. They're constantly conflicting and they're constantly going together. But there's a lot of similarities, especially within this psychology of peace and peacemaking and reconciliation and restorative justice. Yet at the same time, there's some conflict because within the Christian community, it's still, I would say, from my own opinion, like predominantly the thought that you are a Native or a Christian. You can't really be both. And so if you want to be a Christian, you give up your Native identity. I grew up in Montana, but if you think about where tribes are now on reservations, that's only a portion of the land they occupied. So we were nomadic people, and our range would have been up into Canada, down into Kansas, Minnesota, that whole little loop. We were considered a plains tribe. And so through the process of colonization, then we get pushed to this little section of land on Montana. But a lot of our sacred sites, some are in Wyoming and some are in South Dakota. And so, and even down in Denver, we had the Sand Creek Massacre. And so our sacred sites and the places in which we memorialize cover a huge area. And we also have our other relatives, the Southern Cheyenne, live in Oklahoma because we were separated during the process of termination and all that stuff.
Our tradition is kind of rooted in being refugees, leaving Europe to find a safe place. And my family name is Stout. The Stouts and the Orsbrins migrated west, and they tried North Dakota, and then they tried Texas, and they ended up here. So I have some photographs in the house back from the early years of my family's time here. And, you point to it with pride and say, oh, we were hard stuff. We came here and settled and survived. And I took these photographs to a self-service frame shop in Seattle, and I needed help. And I asked the manager if he could help me out. And he looked at me and he goes, I have pictures like these. Oh, really? Yeah, that's interesting. No. I mean, I know these people. We started comparing notes, and we're from the same valley. We had grown up together and didn't know each other. But he was the grandson of a woman who was the last Native in the area to remember life before the settlers came. So she was pretty famous. And it was kind of a mystery that we didn't know each other. And we spent probably 5 hours that day just talking. But one of the things he did is he looked at that photograph and goes, he looked me in the eye and goes, your people killed my people.
European descendants benefit from a violent history of land grabbing and genocide that was justified by patriotism and religion. This same theology formed an international legal structure that continues to dispossess indigenous peoples of their land. What does it mean to be a peacemaker today in a world where the present is defined by the violence of the past?
My grandfather, who I spent a lot of time with, and at one point he took me up to a place west of here, in the Tide, and he said, yeah, we brought about 1,500 head of cattle in here. We're going to let them rest. But then he walked to the edge of the meadow and he pointed to some trees and he said, and we found 2 Indians hanging from that tree. And I could tell, it was serious. And I asked him why, In a lot of Western lore, we have cowboys and Indians fighting it out, but the reality of this coming from my grandfather pointing to the tree where it happened was a little shocking. And he said, well, we're taking their land and they want it back.
In the simplest terms, the doctrine of discovery is the idea under international law that when a European Christian country was the first European to discover new lands, they had a legal right to that area.
The doctrine of discovery defined anybody who is not Christian as less than human and unworthy of land ownership.
The doctrine of discovery, as practiced, is evil. It provided that only those who know Christ are to be the chosen people. And it indicated that those who did not know Christ, who were not baptized, were heathens and had no souls and were animals. As a result of that, those heathens and animals could not own, possess, manage, or use their own indigenous lands.
There is no question that religion was a major part of the doctrine of discovery and justification from the European viewpoint as to why they were predominant and dominant, and God intended for European Christians to have the whole world. And in the famous or infamous papal bulls in 1452 and in 1455, the Pope orders Portugal to invade, subdue the Saracen and which was their word for Muslim, and the pagan of any of whatsoever, take their property, take their lives, govern them, rule it, take. The popes created these papal bulls and started this development of the doctrine of discovery. But this was not a Catholic Church specific movement. The idea of acquiring the lands and rights of indigenous peoples was very much just a European idea, and maybe greed. Let's say the word outright. Queen Elizabeth I is the best example. She was an excommunicated Catholic. She authorized English expeditions to North America to attempt the first English colonies in North America. She complied with the papal bulls, even though she was no longer Catholic. And so she ordered Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who were the first Englishmen authorized by the crown to attempt colonies in what's now the United States. And I can quote you the phrase, she told them, "Go where no Christian prince has yet been, and acquire for me sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title."
And so the race was on for European monarchs to discover and claim as much of the New World as possible in the name of Christ.
Terra nullius is also an aspect of the doctrine of discovery, and there's two aspects of terra nullius. If land was completely empty and no human lives there, when a European power arrived there, they claimed it.
But that wasn't the case when Columbus landed in what is now San Salvador. We were estimated in North and South America, 95 million natives. When the era of extermination by the United States of native peoples ended, we were less than 1 million people. And what happened to all of our ancestors who had a right to live here? Their rights should not have been subjugated by the doctrine of discovery.
But Europeans were pretty intelligent, or should I say sneaky, about interpreting the doctrine of discovery in their own favor. So even if there were human beings where they landed, they still said this land is terra nullius if these people are not using the land in a way European legal systems approve. If they aren't farming, if they aren't using the land to the best and highest use, then that land is terra nullius and is vacant, quote unquote, and available for claim and acquisition by a European power.
In service
So, to answer your question, Mary, I'm not sure who I can't even see, but this link to the whole video, because it's 42 minutes long, is going to be added to your folder. So you will have access if you were interested in watching the whole thing, or you could just Google it too. It's called The Doctrine of Discovery. So I think that this little 8 minutes kind of demonstrates kind of the start of using policy and law, but also using a sort of religious doctrine that people can rationalize in their head. Well, it's the law. It's legal to do this, right? Yeah. And And also that law has been weaponized over and over again and continues to stay weaponized, as we can see with some of the decisions that are coming out of the Supreme Court, some of the gerrymandering stuff that's happening by legislatures across the country, right? So our laws can be weaponized based on who is in that position of power and authority, right? And if you think about us as nomadic people who live off the land, who, you know, I'm Anishinaabe, and up in Anishinaabe country, we go by the season. So we have winter here in Minnesota. And when it's time to, you know, right now it's summer, so we would go to where the berries are growing. In the fall, we would move to where the wild rice is growing. In the winter, you know, we winter camp. So we're going to be by a body of water where we can fish, or where there's good deer and good rabbits, right? So in the spring, we would move to where the maple trees are ready so we can do sugar bush, right? So most of us we move around. And so maybe we're not occupying the land in the appropriate way, but what we're doing is occupying we're using the resources only what we need, taking only what we need, right? That's a deeply held principle for Native folks, is to take only what you need. And so it was so foreign and mind-blowing that somebody would want to come in and own the land. And it's just hard to understand when somebody comes in with those kind of violent tactics, right? And coming in high numbers. So, you know, it's important to remember that for most tribal folks, we're a matrilineal society. Remember what Nicole was talking about yesterday? Yeah, appropriate as a word is weaponized for sure. And oh my gosh, now I forgot what I was singing because I was thinking about appropriation. Let's see. I don't know, I'll probably think of it. But let me get back to the PowerPoint. Oh, hold on. What do other folks think of this? Did folks have any thoughts when they were watching this? Jump on the mic, jump in the chat. Don't be shy.
I get angry, really angry. And sometimes I don't do it on purpose, but I'll get cranky to certain people. I mean, I don't know why. I'll feel mad throughout, like on and off, when I realize, or when I see certain things, or something comes to more in focus about how things are.
Yeah. Was that you, Danielle?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think it's really important there's some epigenetics involved here. There is, you know, our beliefs and values are that our ancestors are just beyond the veil for us. And so the people who have experienced these kinds of termination policies or assimilation policies, that genocide, that lives in us today. And so sometimes our anger can be so vast because it's not of this world, right? It's not of this.
Or like my tribe's language is gone. So it's like, it's some things are more, you know, it makes me think about different things when it comes to my own tribe. You know, it's like we don't have our language. Nobody can talk fluently, you know? So it's just the thing when I think about that my ancestors endured, you know, for us, I get angry sometimes.
And that's exactly why we're talking about oppression as the tactic as it relates to sexual violence, because the anger or the betrayal that Danielle is talking about here, that's very alive and very real right now, and it shows up in our everyday lives. And it also shows up for the people who are causing harm in our communities. You know, the people who are making a choice to use sex as violence in our communities are also feeling these same exact feelings that we're talking about here. And so just be thinking about that, the implications of all that. Even though a lot of those statistics show, some of the statistics say that 85% of the sexual assaults that happen to Native women are caused by non-Native men. That's what the statistics tell us. And then in real time, in our real lives, our own lives, there are harm doers in our own communities and our own families. And so it can be just like this huge thing that's so hard to even comprehend. But this is why those tactics have been put in place. Tactics of oppression are very much at play even today. Right? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go back to the slide. So when you're thinking about working with survivors, especially Native survivors, and it's going to be for other folks as well, but particularly when working with Native folks, must remember that these tactics of assimilation and genocide and colonialism, they're very real and very close to home for us. From a land-based people who live in harmony and relationship with the land, and to be removed from your homeland, that in and of itself is harmful. To have your language beaten or stripped from you in all the different ways, that is still pain that we're living with right now. Many different things. Okay, so we talked about all this, the manifest destiny, the papal bulls, resource extraction. So many times we've had to assume other religions to avoid persecution. In the very beginning of that video, that woman said, there's kind of like this unwritten rule out there that we have to choose. We have to either be Christians or we have to be natives. And just the fact that we are even having that conversation, it can be harmful, right? That we have to choose, and we don't have to choose. If we're, if we have the support around us, we don't have to choose. And in our advocacy, we can tell folks that, we can remind folks about that these tactics were so intentional, and we can interrupt it, right? Okay, I just talked about all that. Rape as a tool of war, cutting down our timber, cutting down our trees. If you think about the reality of coming in to clear the land. So when you are a sustenance, when you live through sustenance, you go out and you harvest a deer and you bring it home to the community to feed your family and feed your community. You go out and snare rabbits. This is obviously a Minnesotan talking, but if you cut down all the trees in a particular place, it's going to impact the animals that are there. It's going to impact the medicines that can grow there. It's going to impact the way water flows in the rivers and creeks and the way rain falls onto the land. It's going to change the land dramatically. I know folks might have heard of that study that they did in Yellowstone when they reintroduced the wolves to that area. And if you haven't, I really, really suggest Googling it and watching it. It's another video on YouTube that's just fascinating how bringing the wolves back to Yellowstone actually started restoring some of the natural habitat there. The way the water flows, the way the plants grow, all of those things. So another way to think about this too is when you interrupt those water routes and those food options and those medicines, those places where we bury our people, the places where we ceremony, the places where we go and fast for our coming of age ceremonies. And when you interrupt that, you're taking away so much from a person's identity. You're interrupting a man's ability to provide for his family, if you want to think about it in those terms. Or, whoever is the person who's the good hunter in your village, you're interrupting that person's ability to provide for their community and their village. And that does something to you when you have lost your sense of purpose and place, right? And it can leave room for other influences, other ideas about who has power, who has status, who has privilege, right? So as you can see, even though it doesn't seem like they're related to sexual violence, they're deeply intricate with sexual violence and tactics of violence. And then somebody had posted, yeah, about, you know, how religion has been, I don't know who, yeah, Isaac, the ways in which our two-spirit relatives are greatly harmed and traumatized by the conquest, right? Just the idea of instilling that homophobia that, you know, we're sinners and we're going to go to hell and we're going against God, all those kinds of messages that also get written into law, right? So not only are there personal, real-time persecution and isolation, but then there's laws written against it, right? Like all the things. And then also too, it's one of the worldviews that we have as Indigenous people is that we're a collective. And the best way to interrupt that is to create ideas about individuality. So if you think about the saying, like, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, you know, like, you know, nobody handed me anything. I had to figure it out on my own. Those kinds of things just reinforce our ideas about individualism versus thinking what is good for the whole, what is good for the village, what is good for the family, what is good for the community, what is good for the world, what is good for our relationship to the land, right? Because one of the things that is not really taught to us, and it's actually with religion, it is taught that God is at the top, right? That human beings are like right below, and that all of the other stuff, the water, the animals, the fish, the gold, the uranium, all the things, you know, that's what's taught in that worldview, is that all of these things are resources for us to use, right? But with Indigenous worldview, it's actually the opposite. Humans are the lowest. We are the most pitiful beings. And everybody, all the other beings know that we're the most pitiful and do their best to help us live and be alive. The trees, were able to cut them down and burn to stay warm in the winter. You know, I was telling that story the other day about the suckerfish who gave their lives so the people could live, right? Like those beings, those sentient beings are taking care of us, and we have a responsibility to take care of them, right? That stewardship, to use our resources appropriately, okay? And that worldview is really skewed right now, and that's going to show up in everyday life, right? So what can we do as advocates to connect people to that worldview? You know, if they're experiencing violence, a lot of times they're not thinking about that. They're just trying to get by every day of their lives. And what ways can we strengthen those connections to the land, to our spiritual practices? That's going to help us heal. It's going to help us feel connected. It's going to interrupt these sort of other practices that are happening all around us. Yeah. So, you know, with the papal bulls and stuff, you know, that happened in the 1400s, right? But it never stopped. It's still happening today, as we know. But these are some really impactful policies that if you're not familiar, it would be helpful to have a little bit of an understanding about them. There'll be an appendices that kind of breaks it down a little bit more than these bullet points. But you could just Google it too. So, you know, in 1819, the Congress, you know, they get together and they talk about all this stuff. And so they appropriated $10,000 to civilize us back in 1819. But as you can see, by 1881, they had upped that amount to $3 million. So if you think about that in 50, 60 years, and how much $3 million was back in those days, that's allocating a lot of money to assimilate us into dominant culture, a lot of money. And one thing that I never knew is that they had a little bit of infighting amongst themselves on who got to put boarding schools where. So it was the churches who got together and said, well, the Catholics are going to take this region and the Protestants are going to take this region and the Lutherans, right? So they had their own internal, because it was about money. There's so much money involved in opening up these boarding schools, but there's also this idea that if you kill the Indian, you save the man, right? That was Colonel Pratt who kind of coined that term. Because that was the belief system. And you were talking earlier about that propaganda. So all of these things came with propaganda to make people afraid of Indians, that we're just savages and we're going to kill you. And of course, there's some truth to it, because we were fighting to stay alive and fighting to, keep our homeland and to not be put on a land that we're unfamiliar with or to be forced into farming, right? I agree, Danielle. I agree. This is one of those kinds of things that it's just information that helps us understand the systems that have been in place for so many generations. Like, it doesn't have to be like an Indian law class when you're doing your advocacy, but it also doesn't hurt to know that the tactics were so planned and well funded, because that can help us understand that it's not an individual's problem, right? Like the individual is experiencing the suffering, but that's what when we had that first discussion about the difference between a case management style and an advocacy style, right? The systems would have us believe that it's just, if we just work with that individual and we get them the resources they need, then everything's going to be fine. And that's true. And we have to be thinking about, how do we organize and show up around Roe v. Wade? How do we organize and show up around the ability for people who love one another to get married, right? So it's a both and, it's always a both and you will use your instinct and your heart to know when it's time to share other kinds of information. And maybe it's not in that first time that you're meeting with somebody, or even the first year, but if we can create entry points for people to start learning about this stuff, because we're not taught this, are we? In school, we sometimes have to go to college before we even hear anything about it. It is just not commonly taught information, and we think it should be because it's so impactful, right? Yeah, you'll know when it's time to expose people to this kind of information. I don't know. Yeah. Because
go ahead. No, I think when I was working in a clinic with a lot of non-natives, it was really helpful and informational for people who worked within the communities and benefited from these systems that that brought them to their place to understand where a lot of our trauma comes from. So for those who may not be within the community or unaware of it within our own families, this can really ignite a passion and changing those systems that people benefit from. Mm-hmm. That you don't necessarily have to share it within, because a lot of this is still in our blood trauma. Our family members lived through the Indian Civilization Act, the Removal Act. So it would just be naming it within our own clients and our families, but we live and breathe it. So I definitely hear you a lot, Danielle.
Yeah, it's a lot of information. It's a lot, but it's many generations too of tactics and practices and law, making it legal. Somebody at some point made slavery legal. Somebody at some point in South Africa made apartheid legal, right? And so just knowing the power of our legislation means that we can start to understand that it is a institutional and systemic thing and not something about us individually. It just helps to broaden the perspective, right? And of course, it's still happening. voter suppression laws, ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act is up on the chopping block. Actually, I haven't even watched the news. It might have already been chopped. If anybody knows anything about that, feel free to share. So, they're constantly trying to dismantle whatever sovereignty and good things we're trying to put into place. And, it's ongoing. The fight is ongoing. And we've already talked about a lot of this impact, right? But one thing we haven't talked about is it has, in addition to interrupting all of our sacred sites and sacred rituals and practices, it interrupted our ability to hold people accountable who caused harm, right? For Anishinaabe people, we have Wainabuju. He's like our trickster. And even our old legends that you can only tell when there's snow on the ground, even Wainabuju legends tell us that we were not a utopian people. We had people who did things wrong way back in the day, pre-contact. But built into those legends and those stories was how a harm doer's actions impacted the whole village, right? So we had swift response and swift action and how to respond to those things. I've heard lots of different practices over time. There's a village up in Canada where they take the harm doer, the men take the harm doer out to an island on Rainy Lake. Rainy Lake is this huge lake in northern Minnesota on the border between Canada and Minnesota. And they take the harm doer to an island and they just leave him out there for a couple of days. And then the men go back and they check on him and they say, talk to us about the harm that you've caused our village. And so what they're doing is that instantaneous and loving accountability. And accountability is a terrible English word, but it's being good relatives to one another and understanding the impact that web of life, when one person pulls on the web of life, the whole web moves, right? And I think we have been taught sometimes through many generations that we don't matter, right? That we are invisible, disposable, unlovable, broken, all the things that we learn as survivors of sexual violence, right? And so how do we restore that? What does that look like to restore that? Understanding that tactics were put in place to go ahead and try to sever your thread in the web of life, right? So anytime we can restore that connection, we're doing good work, right? Yeah, our language, our government systems, our clan systems, our roles are built into our clan systems, right? So when you dismantle that, you're dismantling our ways of being relatives to one another. But slowly we're starting to recover that in different ways. Even if we don't have our full access to our full language, we can still start putting some of our principles back into place. Right? So another thing too is that, there is a continuum of assimilation, right? So it's 2022, there's not many of us, with the exception of those folks living in Alaska that I was watching on TV last night, still getting seal and all of that. But for real, in real time, even they drove out to the ocean on a four-wheeler and they had a rifle to shoot the seal, right? So we have modernized because we're not fools. When we have the proper tools that are going to make our lives better and easier, then we're going to do it. That's just common sense. That's just smart thinking, right? So, but that is also can be a place where internalized oppression can show up, right? Where we can have a saying, oh, well, look, they don't even know to wear a skirt to ceremony, or They don't even know to put out their tobacco when they harvest some blueberries, right? So we can shame out one another, right? I'm sure y'all have experienced or seen it happen in our communities where we can have placed judgment or shame people out for what they know or what they don't know. But that is a tactic. We have to remember that that's a tactic, forcing us to divide. It's like a divide and conquer tactic, right? To sort of facilitate the ways in which we shame out one another. Okay. There's people who have the access and the safety to learn some of those traditional practices, to learn that language, right? Danielle just said she doesn't have access to the language, right? By design, her language was eradicated. And so how could we fault Danielle if she doesn't speak her language, right? Because her language was squashed out. So we have to remember that there are tactics at play. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And I also want to add too that so much of it is the forced assimilation. There's a person in the village next to me over here who their family kept one of our highest lodges. It's called the Medewan Lodge in Anishinaabe, for Anishinaabe people. And they kept that lodge. But when the missionaries came, they told this family, you have to stop practicing that. That's the devil's way. And you need to quit and convert to Christianity. But that family said, no way, this is who we are. I'm making the story short. And the family said, no way. Well, then when you start putting people on plots of land and forcing them to farm, you start cutting down the trees so there's no food, then you create a situation where the missionaries can provide food. So they're bringing in flour, lard, sugar, tea, those kinds of things, and getting the people dependent on that food coming in because they can't get their natural food because it's all been removed around them, right? So it's tactics. And what the missionaries told this family is that we're going to stop bringing rations to this village unless you convert to Christianity. So that family converted to Christianity, but they had to go underground. So they basically had to do their ceremony in secret because they didn't want the village to suffer with no food, right? So you can see how deviant that tactic is, right? And it happened all over for many generations and in many different situations. So that forced adaptation, that forced assimilation, just to keep your people alive. Even when you've been relocated to reservations and you have to make a decision whether to send your child to boarding school or not. If you have no food at home, you might be more likely to send your kid to boarding school, right? And all the harm that comes with that, the guilt that comes with being a mother who sends their kid to boarding school, all the things, the complexities of that. That's happening in real time right now. And it's by design that we're struggling with that today. And also we're on a continuum of safe access, right? So we have a whole module later on about spiritual abuse. So spiritual, we know that it happens in the church and stuff like that, but we're not exempt from spiritual abuse happening in our own communities or people using their cultural knowledge to cause harm to others. Right? So sometimes we don't have safe access to people who can share our rituals, our protocols, our language, our medicines, some of those ceremonial practices, those ancestral teachings, right? And so, if you're able to build relationships with people who have that safe access, then do so. That will strengthen our advocacy, right? And check in, meet the person where they're at, find out, do you have safe access? Is it something of interest to you to learn some of your rituals and practices or go to ceremony? And know too that sometimes, for me personally, my sexual abuse happened in and during ceremony. So when I was coming out of my violence, I didn't want to go to ceremony. That place was dangerous for me, right? And so you have to, as an advocate, you have to check in with the person that you're working with to see, what it is that they need. Are they interested in that? And then our advocacy would help support whatever their needs are, right? So let's take a breath first, right? Because that's a lot, right? It's painful stuff. But let's talk about some of the tactics that you've seen or experienced or have observed around you. Normally, when we're in a room together, we'll break into groups and we'll do this exercise in the room. But since we're, on Zoom, we'll just do it virtually in one big room, if that's okay. Is that okay? Okay. All right, I got one thumbs up. I got one yes in the chat. Yay. All right, so if you think about, there's many different tactics of oppression, but a couple of the core ones you can kind of be summed up into these 5. So using violence without any consequences, controlling oppressed groups by splitting them into good and bad, so like the collaborators and the resistors, promoting belief in the superiority of the oppressors. There's making the oppressed into inferior objects, and then teaching submission to the oppressed. So what are some examples of using violence without any consequences? And what people or institutions or places do you see using violence without any consequences? Police?
Police.
Yeah, police, Supreme Court, native jurisdiction, in all caps. All caps, exactly. Who else uses violence without consequences? Schools, white people, spiritual leaders, neoliberal economic markets. Dang, Mariana. Yeah, get some. Academia. Spanking our children. Family. GTC. Summer, what's GTC? Oh yeah, tribal council, yep. Bullies. Capitalism for sure is violence without consequences. Military. Even within our own families, right? Spanking our kids is a good example that boys will be boys. Oh, they're just being boys. Yeah. Food systems. Healthcare. Tribal organizations do it. Yep. Yeah, there's so many places that it shows up, right? And even, sometimes the consequences are, they might get a little slap on the wrist for doing something, but it's nothing of consequence, right? It's not really that impactful. Dominant culture, even in families teasing folks. Many different ways. We could probably think of a million more. Indian child welfare, right? Taking kids away, child protection services. Yes, because they have the institutional authority to do so, right? That's somebody made a law that made that the authority. And so our role as advocates is to interrupt those things that are causing harm or being barriers. Border Patrol, ICE, state and federal governments, the Constitution. Y'all got this. The justice system. Yes. Tell it. right? Tell it. Okay, how about this one? Controlling oppressed groups by splitting them into good and bad. The collaborators and the resistors, the good Indians or the bad Indians. How do people do that? How do groups of people do that? Split us into good and bad. Media. Democrats and Republicans. Definitely the nonprofit industrial complex. Laws geographically relocating people. Yeah. Schools, colorism. Yep. Churches. Money. Homophobia and transphobia, globalization. No worries, Cassandra, keep on coming back. Funding sources, like who gets funded and who doesn't, right? How we dictate how you spend your money, cultural differences. Look at even protesting, right? The, the Aimster, I've heard them called Aimster gangsters because they use tactics that may not be approved or appropriate to some people, right? They're the bad resistors because they used weapons, right? Or Standing Rock, right? Folks who show up at Standing Rock, well, they're the bad Indians because they should just let us make all this money on oil going through their land, right? How do we split sexual abuse or sexual assault survivors into good and bad? Ones who report and ones who don't, ones who collaborate with law enforcement, choosing their own path, position in the community, substance use, yep, whether they're coping with substance or not, makes them a good victim or a bad victim. And all the ones that we listed for the prior one, the degree of assault, for sure. All of the ones we listed could apply here to the silent versus outspoken. Yes. Very good. The ones who need resources versus the ones who don't. Survivors of manipulation or coercion. Multiple victimizations. Whether they're in a relationship with their attacker or not. Yes. And as advocates, we're in a gatekeeper position to some degree when we're working with folks. We can engage in our own version of oppressive thinking by saying, and they should just leave, right? How come they haven't left yet? So I'm not saying that we do that, but I'm saying that we have the potential to do that, right? Somebody had mentioned those who, whether there was a bunch of things, y'all get what I'm saying, right? Like we have to check our own biases and our own oppressive thinking when we're doing our advocacy, right? Lolita trope or stereotype. Yeah. Okay, what about this one? How do we promote the belief in the superiority of the oppressors? What are some tactics that we've seen historically or even now that promote belief in the superiority of the oppressor? School systems. Western scientific rationale, logical thought, and research paradigms. Yeah. What else? How do we promote belief? Naming schools, buildings, libraries, statues after the harm doers. Representation in the media, whitewashing things. How does it happen in the lives of sexual assault survivors? How is promoting belief in the superiority of the oppressor show up when it comes to sexual assault survivors? Victim blaming, court system, Yeah. If the person's going to report it and try to go into the court system, they're going to have to prove that the person did it, right? They're going to have evidence or a confession or a witness. Yep, the burden of proof is on the victim. The way we're treated by police, access to financial resources, jurisdiction and investigations. Y'all are on fire. Yes. Classism. Or even the person who's causing the harm, right? Like sexual assault, there's a broad range, there's a broad variety of sexual assault, right? There can be the person who you've never seen before in your life who hurts you, or it can be somebody in your own family for years or generations, right? Like the gold digger or belief folks are just after money, you know. And so, you know, the tactics of power and control within our own families happen too, right? Where that they are the head of the household, they're the boss, or we can weaponize our traditional teachings about the role of men in our families, right? Which is patriarchy slipping into our matriarchal ways, right? Okay. So it shows up all different kinds of insidious ways. What about this one? How do we make oppressed people into inferior objects? What are ways that and tactics used to make oppressed people into inferior objects? Sexualization and fetishization, laws, exotifying. Yeah, Nicole's just talking about that when she did the Garden of Truth interviews with Native women used in prostitution. A lot of them talked about them wanting to role play, you know, with the long black hair and, you know, the Pocahontas thing. That's very, very real-time stuff. Dehumanizing. Look at war, right? Video games, the way video games are, that you're just a spot on the screen, right? Hyper invisibility as well. Oh, yes. Minimizing our sovereignty, belonging with stereotypes or using demeaning language like the $5 Indian, erasure, objectifying and generalizing stereotypes, slurs. We can be bought and sold, right? We become just a transaction. Okay, it shows up all different kinds of ways. And so all the things that we listed, pan-Indigenous rhetoric, that could show up across all the pillars, right? Mary's on fire. How do we teach submission? How have we taught submission to the oppressed? How do we teach submission? Not we. How does anybody teach submission to oppressed people? Denial of resources, preventing cultural traditions, silent shame, accepting their tactics, making them believe it will never change, internalized fear of reporting, right? Limiting access. So if you think of like on a broad scale, the boarding schools, you know, the Trail of Tears, but in modern times, the Supreme Court decisions, co-optation, dividing, limiting access norms. If you think about, you know, going to a boarding school and having your hair cut, having your clothes changed, you know, being beaten if you spoke your language, that's many generations of internalizing that we're not good, right? That we're bad. For a sexual assault victim, can show up in all the same ways, just a little bit different tactic, right? Unilateral violence, a 3-step process, break them down, give them something else to believe, and make it so they can't change without consequence. Stigmatizing and framing self-defense as violence. What?
Me and Mary, I am just like, yes, Mary. Yeah, Mary, you don't surprise me. Another one.
Man, we could go off on another whole tangent on that self-defense is violence conversation. Woo, woo. Awesome. So yeah, those tactics and many more that I'm sure we'll kind of ponder. And once we start thinking about it in the framework of tactics, many generations in the past that are still impacting us now, they're still making up new ones today. They're sitting at the Supreme Court and in House of Representatives all across this country right now, still trying to hold it up because there is a lot of money and a lot of power at play right now. And Native folks are in this position of constantly trying to just keep their footing, keep their land, keep their sovereign ability to govern their own people, right? That is constantly at play even now. Survivors every day are trying to figure out how to keep their footing, in the face of all of these tactics. So our role as advocates can be to do our best to interrupt these pillars and also try to remove any barriers and do our best to meet that survivor wherever they're at, right? So it's a big ask, but it's also an important ask to be thinking about dismantling the pillars at the same time as we're doing all of our other stuff, right? Because we want to end it. We want to make it easier for the next generations coming up. We want to use the words openly and not be afraid, because that silence is violence, and it's just going to keep holding it up, right? Okay, I just talked about that. And these are, it's not that it's all horrible and doom and gloom. There's lots of good things that are happening, right? But these are also all things that can be eradicated, right? The Indian Child Welfare Act, which is supposed to protect us, it's supposed to say when you have to remove a Native child from the family for their own safety, that they should go to another family member, or they should at least stay in the village that they're from or the reservation that they're from, or if they can't find placement there, to at least go with another Native family. And that's to keep the continuity of our identity in place, right? If you get adopted or fostered out into a place that is non-Native, then you just lose track of all of it. So it's a law right now, but it's being attacked right now in the Supreme Court. So the Indian Religious Freedom Act, it's not safe either, right? We kind of thought Roe v. Wade was safe, and it's not. So we're constantly at threat to lose whatever gains we have made. It was finally legal in 1978 for us to even, to burn some sage or to have a ceremony, right? 1978, that wasn't that very long ago. So people have fought, just regular people like us saw that things were so bad and something needed to change, and they organized and got together and said, what do we have to do to make this safer and better and legal, right? Changleshka, the first reservation to pass pro-arrest codes. Women and Nations was the first urban shelter in Minnesota. They named the Sacred Hoop. So these are all things that have kind of been changes for good, right? 1994, we got the Violence Against Women Act. OVC was funded in 1998. OJP mandated the government-to-government basis, working with the government-to-government relationships, right? Our tribal coalitions were getting formed in the early 2000s, right? MIWSAC, we're the first sexual assault specific coalition ever. That is something I have deep, humble pride in, right? To focus specifically on sexual assault. Our first tribal consultation was held in 2006, right? So good things. National Congress of American Indians and the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. If you're not familiar with those two organizations, if you Google them, You will, Mary mentioned, I don't know what UNDRIP is. United Nations, say what it is.
United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
That should be in here. I'm gonna write it down. So Google some of these things if you're not familiar, because it will help you to understand that there is a huge amount of work and organizing being done, that it's not all bad stuff, right? The tribal unit was established in 2006. The Tribal Law and Order Act got passed in 2010. We'll be talking a lot more about the Tribal Law and Order Act coming up. You know, making sure that we're understanding that having our harm doers be responsible and not the victim, right? Standing outside of the systems to make sure we can put those things into place, recognizing those political structures. I know as a survivor, when I understood that there were so many tactics at play, both beyond my wildest comprehension, all the way to the fact that my harm doer was in boarding school and probably learned a lot of violence when they were in boarding school, right? Like even to understand that it wasn't me, that it wasn't something that I did or didn't do that caused that violence, that there were so many other things out there at play in our lives, that helped me. It helped me in a very spiritual way. And so it might help somebody else to know that they're just tactics. There's nothing wrong with us. Okay, we've talked about a lot of this. Anytime we can get good codes on the books in our own nation, that's good. Restoring our cultural practices is also, you know, something that we cannot talk about enough, right? What do you do in your communities or villages when somebody comes of age? You know, what are the practices that you have? And if you don't have them or know them, can you create some that are healthy, right? We are a living, breathing, you know, our cultures are living and breathing. There are ancestral practices that we have that have been passed down since time immemorial. And we are in a place of, we can create ceremony and create good things for the people. If it's been stripped from us, can we create new ones, right? Even if it's something like harvesting some cedar and boiling up some cedar in water. And you know, you can make a little tiny sweat lodge, put a towel over your head and just have a little tiny sweat lodge. Or you can put a washer, let it cool and put a wash rag in there and wash off with it. That cedar, the spirit in that cedar is so powerful that it can take away so much of our hurt, right? If we ask for help from that cedar, things like that, like there is a belief that has kind of been forced on us that there has to be a person involved in our spirituality, right? That comes through like Christianity, that there's a God, and if we worship anything other than the one God, that I think it's demigods, or I'm not too clear on it, but it's a sin to believe that there are other sentient beings out there, right? And so reclaiming that there is no person needed for us to have a spiritual connection, right? Nobody needs to be involved if I go sit by the water and ask that water to help me. Or if I go sit by a tree and I feel the bark of the tree on my back or rubbing on my arm, right? That's a connection that there's no human being required for that. When you hold a stone, you can ask that grandfather, the spirit in that stone, to help you hold that information. We can talk to our survivors about finding a stone. And then maybe they want to be done with what they put in that stone and go out and chuck that rock across the parking lot or across the woods or across the road, right? Like there are ceremonies that we can create in addition to the ones that we've had for time immemorial. Right? All right. So we'll take a little break. I'm gonna play this video because it's just such a good way to wrap up this module. And then we'll take a break and we'll come back at 3:00 or for me, it's 3:00. I don't know what it is in your time zone, but at the top of the hour after we play this video. But this video is a good one. I don't know if y'all heard of it. Lila June. Okay, so, after this video, go ahead and just move into the break. Take good care of yourselves. Drink some water, walk around, get a snack. Okay? And we'll see you at the top of the hour. Can you see a moccasined foot? Yeah?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Here we go.
This people, shine your light, we are equal. I remember the days when our prayers were illegal. I remember the days when being Indian was lethal. Yeah, we had a rough past, but get ready for the sequel. Get ready for the glorious comeback of our people. Oh, yeah. Rise up, all you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart. Can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up, wake up. All nations rise. Rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's our time. All nations rise, rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's our time. With forgiveness as my bow and my prayers as my arrows, pull them back and let go. I watch them fly like sparrows. Have hope. Yeah, have hope. With compassion as my shield and faith down to my marrow, I will walk the pollen path even when it gets narrow. Yeah, I resurrect. Yes, you can bet that we seen the single mama raising children on the rest. We seen domestic violence tear apart what we have left. We seen the alcohol take it all and leave us dead. We seen the children take their lives when they can't take the dread anymore. It's a war. Can't take the dread anymore. No, we can't take the dread anymore. It's a war. No, we can't take the dread anymore. It's a war, but we've seen it all before. And now we know we can change it, 'cause that's why we were born. We know we are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are the ones Grandma has been praying for. So rise up, all you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart. Can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up, wake up. Pueblo hermoso, levántense, es nuestro tiempo. No tienes que esconderte más. Ahora es nuestro tiempo. Mujer indígena, tú eres tan sagrada. Traigas medicina de tu suelo todavía. A pesar del abuso de tu cuerpo y tu tierra, respetamos tus ancestros y la suya cultura. Hombre indígena, tú eres honorable y yo veo la fuerza que todavía sobrevive a pesar del abuso de tu raza venerable. Yo respeto tus ritos, tus danzas, tus padres. Somos guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz. Sí, no vamos a escondernos más. Somos guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz. Sí, no vamos a escondernos más. All nations
They say that history is written by the victors. But how can there be a victor when the war isn't over? The battle has only just begun, and Creator is sending His very best warriors. And this time, It isn't Indians versus the Cowboys. No, this time it is all the beautiful races of humanity together on the same side, and we are fighting to replace our fear with love. And this time bullets, arrows, and cannonballs won't save us. The only weapons that are useful in this battle are the weapons of truth, faith, and compassion.
Man, that's some good stuff right there. All right, folks, let's take a good juicy break, okay? And we'll see you at the top of the hour, okay? See you in a little bit. I'm gonna pause the recording. Thank you to our interpreters and everybody who had some comments in the chat. Awesome stuff. All right, you guys, see you in a bit. Recording. All right, welcome back. The poll is up. What's your favorite snack? Salty things. Sour things. I'm a sour person. I can eat pickles and kimchi and vinegary things all day. Linda's here.
I was actually trying to say Linda's name once, and I almost came out as lit Linda. I was like, what? Linda, happy to see you.
She's pretty lit. She's pretty lit. Linda, are you, what's your plan here, Linda? Are you here to support? Are you here to present? So our coworkers had a very, very busy morning. So she may be handling some business. So I'm just gonna keep on trucking until she gives me a different word. Okay, so the poll, I will go ahead and end it. You're welcome to add your favorite snack in the chat, but I'll share the results where we're at now. I think salty won. Look at that. 34 of us said salty, 20 said sweet, 14 sour. 7 of us love that mac and rice. Few of us are healthy with fruits and veggies at 17 and 7. It depends for me. And then when it's hot out, there's some things I don't want to eat when it's too hot. Yeah. Awesome. Carbs of all kinds, Kayla said. We need a debate between Takis or Hot Cheetos. Bold, Mariana said. Any kind of potatoes. Yeah. All right. All right. So, second module or last module of the day is the sex offender module, what advocates need to know. And, you know, if you were to be an agenda person and look at the agenda, we're a little bit behind, but that's okay. It's, we will navigate as we go, and we will always conclude our day on time at 4:30. that's a commitment from us to you all that will not interrupt your time outside of what we committed to here. Okay, so we'll make it work. So what do we need to know? So if we're thinking about our advocacy, what do we need to know about sex offenders, right? So the basic characteristics of sex offenders. And one of the other things too is, sex offender is a legal term. So it has its own legal definition, but there's other ways to think about it too. People who cause harm, right, as it relates to gender-based violence. And people who cause harm are sometimes unknown to us, and sometimes we know them, right? We're related to them. Sometimes we love them, and they can still be harm doers. And so we hold that truth simultaneously. It's a both and, it's not an either or. And it gets complex when the harm doers in our lives are people that we know or maybe love, or maybe we have trusted, or maybe we need them for a variety of reasons, right? So just holding the truth that it's complex in our own communities. Okay, what do we need to know about the systems designed to protect the public? Just some basics on state, federal, and tribal jurisdiction, some basics on sex offender registration, right? Recognizing some common treatment models for sex offenders. What are the objectives of sex offender treatment? And then also some common tactics used by harm doers. What does that grooming look like? Talking a little bit about that. And the reason these are helpful to kind of go into, in our advocacy, it helps us to kind of understand what the law is. It
Today, about a month ago.
It helps us to understand some of the tactics that are used. And kind of, I kind of keep thinking back on Danielle's comment about when she's working with somebody who's being trafficked, they're trying to survive their life in that moment. And to be dumping a bunch of information about, assimilation policies, that's probably not a good time to do that, right? And even when it comes to the tactics that harm doers may use, we're going to use our own instinct and discernment when it's time to share some of that information with somebody you're working with. It will click in your mind about, this might be an ideal time to tell them about this, that this is actually a tried and true tactic that harm doers use, right? And what that does is it helps take the responsibility, because we will try every kind of way to own the harm that we're experiencing. At least as a survivor myself, I know I've done it every different kind of way. I should have told somebody, I should have fought back, I should have never even done that in the first place. I'll use any kind of rationalization in my head because my spirit is trying to figure it out, right? And what we're not taught to do is place the blame where it lies, on the person who caused the harm. So as advocates, it just helps us to understand, a harm doer a little bit. And that's what we'll talk about, okay? So what we do know is that the statistics say that we almost always know the harm doer, right? They almost always know their victim. And so less than 20% of abusers are strangers. And then the harm doer, if it's a child being abused, it's often, if not a blood relative, a kinship. There's kinship relationship there. Like we know that not all relationships are blood relationships, but it's somebody who's known when it comes to a child. We also know that the people who are, accused of sexual assault or the ones that get reported, very few of them actually are convicted and sentenced to prison time, right? So if you were to line up 100 people who have experienced sexual assault, only 10 of those 100 people will even report it, right? And so then now you have 10 people on the line. And then only about 3 or 4 of those people who report it will arrest be made, right? So now there's only 3 or 4 people standing here. And then only about half maybe 2 or 3 of them, there'll be arrests and convictions, right? So then 65% of those couple of people are given probation. So somebody somewhere along the line did the math, and it's like 0.00 whatever percent. The bottom line is that very few people by the numbers are convicted and sentenced to prison. So that's a question that as advocates, as activists, as abolitionists, as people trying to dismantle the conditions of violence, what does that mean for survivors if that few people are convicted and sentenced to prison? Is being convicted and sentenced to prison the only option? Is that how we get our justice? Right? So if you're working with Native folks, what does that mean for us? A lot of times I hear in my world, we just want the violence to stop, right? Like maybe we don't want to lose another one of our family members to the system. Maybe we just want the violence to stop, right? So it could be anything. And our role as an advocate is to check in with that survivor to find out, what does justice look like for them? What are the pros and cons or the options or the pathways of reporting it, of going into the court system, of going to do the forensic exam, right? And, we'll be talking throughout the rest of the month about some of these systems that we'll engage in. But these are just things to be thinking of as we're kind of leading into the rest of the training now, okay? And there's no right or wrong answer. People have deeply held beliefs about what should happen to somebody who hurts others. And that's good and that's okay. And we're also going to check our own personal biases at the door when we're working with somebody and meet them where they're at, right? So what do we think? Do we think there's more sex offenses happening in our communities than what's being reported? Yay, nay? Yeah. Yeah. So why do you think people don't report? Well, more specifically, why do you think that they don't tell the police, like report to somebody official?
It can be extremely traumatizing for victims to deal with like a group of people or institution such as law enforcement that are like painfully unequipped to deal with victims. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That sums it right up, right? If they're not equipped to hear the information, or also, a law enforcement, a police officer, their whole training is to get the facts, collect the evidence, write down the facts, right? Like that's what their job is. That's what they're trained to do. What they're not trained to do is hear the nuance and understand the complexities, especially in Native communities or, any community that's not in the mainstream. They're just not trained how to do that. And so, of course, individual people will be better or worse at that. But generally, as an institution, their whole job is about getting the facts, trying to find a law that was broken. And that's, we're lucky if that's happening, right? Yep. Embarrassed or shameful, re-traumatizing process, knowing that the case might not be taken seriously. The victim isn't always aware of what happened to them. Like if it's a child, shame, the awareness that a minute percentage of perpetrators get convicted. Yeah. Yeah.
In the chat too, it says about retaliation, that there could be retaliation.
Yeah. Yeah. So we may tell somebody, right? But it might not be, and we may swear them to secrecy, right? Like it could be all different kinds of things. Right? We may tell our best friend or a sister or an auntie, or Or maybe we call a 1-800 number and just say, I just need to talk. You know, maybe they call a crisis line somewhere and say, I just need to talk, but I don't want to tell anybody else, right? So their entry point is really important, right? And so that's why we always believe a survivor when they disclose, no matter what. Fear of no one believing them. Yeah. Slut shaming, believing it was their fault. Yeah. Sometimes perpetrators work in law enforcement. Thank you very much. Yes. Okay, so all the nuances. Yes. So who are, now no names here, I'm not saying to name names, but who are the suspected sex offenders in your community? No names, because, you know, I'm not trying to, but who are they? Having their character be drawn into question. Teachers, leaders, family members, powwow dancers, MCs, spiritual guides, college students, siblings, people in power, neighbors. So pretty much it can be anybody, right? Directors, activists, wow, yeah, parents. Mary, tell us about activists.
So activists are folks who kind of move in organizing spaces, so community spaces, usually grassroots community spaces, nonprofit, industrial complex, or frontline defense movements, but they use their clout as community activists and kind of like community heroes to kind of be predatory with folks for the purposes of, you know, sex or dating or relationships or stuff like that.
Thank you. Yes, they're often charismatic people, right? Even if they're a coach or a teacher or whoever, the ones that we listed. Yeah, elders, they're usually charismatic. People are drawn to them for whatever reason because of their personality or their skill. You know, in Indian country, people who know the language or know rituals and ceremonies, that they can be also, you know, to some degree they're revered, you know, for these skills that they have. And it's very true in activist communities where we have been historically so silenced and so invisibilized and so targeted. To see somebody doing such good work can be so beautiful to see. And we can be spiritually attracted to that energy. And so if somebody has not done their own work on themselves, they may use that power to cause harm around them, right? Children engaging in learned behavior, anyone with status. Something we saw a lot at Standing Rock, it wasn't addressed well. Yeah. Elizabeth's talking about some elders coming out in the community, even though they're violent perpetrators. So we're not, you know, nobody's immune to it. Even our genders, there's no, you know, there's harm doers across the gender spectrum. Child on child, where neither person truly understands what they're doing. Yeah, so that's important to note too, that, you know, there is a time in a person's life when they're not understanding, when they're not using it as a harm tactic, they're probably more than likely using it as a coping tactic or something that they've learned, or there's not a correlation to what the pleasure centers are in the body and consent, right? There's just some things developmentally that we don't learn until we're a little bit older, all the way up to they know exactly what they're doing and they're going to use whatever means they can for their own personal gratification, right? Okay. So this is another legal definition that we cover. I didn't understand it when I first started thinking about it, but the reason that we bring it up is because pedophilia, you know, it's a legal definition. It's in the, it's a, what's the DSM? I'm not sure what number we're at right now, but you know, it's actually a diagnosable, I don't know what the word is, it's diagnosable to be a pedophile. So if you're a pedophile, you're sexually attracted to children, right? And you can be a pedophile without actually ever having, okay, we're up to 5 now, DSM-5. So you can be a pedophile, but never have caused physical harm to a child. Now, something that my brain has a hard time wrapping around, like, but when we're talking about, in legal terms, we just have to note that. So sometimes it's helpful in the language that we use, because people may try to flip that language on us, right? Look at that, it just says it right there. It's not a legal term, it's a psychiatric diagnosis. And that's what I meant to say, that it's not a legal term, it's a diagnosis. And, as opposed to like a child molester is a person who actually touches children, right? But they don't legally become a child molester until they have victimized a child. Yeah, they don't have to be in the registry, no. And so a child molester can have a sexual life that doesn't involve children. They can be in a relationship and having sex, active sex life, but there's still that distinction being a child molester and getting gratification from children. Okay? That just seems so, I just don't know exactly why we talk about this in terms of our advocacy. Unless it comes up in a situation, where there's some sort of legal battle going on, it just helps us to understand it, that there is a distinction, right, between a psychiatric diagnosis and like a legal definition. So I guess that's why we talk about it. Okay. So I think somebody mentioned it. Yeah, I think Isaac mentioned it, child on child sexual abuse. So, they do commit sex crimes. The statistics say about 2,200 arrests yearly. Yeah, Mary, there are some people who are trying to attach pedophilia to the LGBTQIA community, which is very wrong. So they're trying to get some sort of legal protections. They're organizing, and it's pretty smart for them to be organizing in that way and trying to get legal protections, but that's exactly the power of our legal system, right? So they can weaponize the legal system again and cause harm to people. And yeah, there's some studies out there. They got a whole movement around it. It's not cool, very dangerous. So in this research, 20% of the offenders were under 18. Boys represented 90% of those arrests made, right? So you can see that this is why we kind of talk about it. Even though all genders can commit sexual violence, there is a gendered nature to it because of the culture of violence that we're living in, because of patriarchy, because of homophobia, because of the isms that we've been talking about, power, privilege, access, all the things, right? So there's something that we have to just take note of in our culture, where a large percent of our healthy masculinity, all the things are interconnected. So some characteristics of juvenile offenders, really high levels of violence that they have experienced, right? May have learning disabilities, profound victimization experiences, and limited impulse control. So that can come from just being young. Your prefrontal cortex is still developing. Ilea dropped an article in there, the prison pipeline focusing on young girls. That's awesome. I should probably click that link so I don't lose it. Limited impulse control can happen for lots of reasons. So for being young and just not developing it, but also if there is some FASD or some sort of other, physiological thing that's happening in the body. So there's lots of reasons. It doesn't make them bad or wrong, It just is. And we have to take it into consideration. So when we're thinking about, how to respond to those who cause harm, there has to be a differentiated response for young people. And what are the nuances of why that child is engaging in harmful sexual behavior, right? So childhood sexual abuse does not predict future sexual aggression. Right? There's no compelling evidence that they're likely to become sex offenders as they grow up. And female victims, by the numbers, statistically significantly at lower rates, right? So contributing factors could be the age, the number of incidents of violence, how much time has gone by, right? The perceptions of how the family responded, exposure to violence in the home. So, all those words to me just mean like everybody wants to matter. As human beings in this world, as spirits who came to this earth, we want to matter. We want to matter to somebody. And we mostly want to matter to the people we're closest to, right? And if you are shown that you don't matter, it can be some contributing factors. And we have to acknowledge that, right? We have to start looking at that and taking responsibility for that as a community. Like, how do we make sure our children are seen, right? And know that they matter, that they are a part of the web of life. Their thread in the web of life is everything. So I was talking earlier about that most rapists of Native women are non-Native men. So it was the, oh my goodness. Yeah, why am I blanking on what it is? So the DOJ statistics, but it was a report that they went into South Dakota, Oklahoma, and some other, Amnesty International, there it is. So Amnesty International went in and did a lot of asking about, who caused, what are the statistics for you? And it was found that more than 2.5 times they're more likely to be sexually assaulted than other women in the US, and 86% were non-Native. So we have to take into consideration, a lot of times there's border situations, where there's reservations on a border town, right? The people who live in urban populations, right? And we'll be talking more about this throughout the month, but we have no jurisdiction or very limited jurisdiction over non-Native offenders. So non-Natives know that we can't do anything to them for sexually assaulting our people. And so it increases the way that we're targeted. We'll talk more about that as we go. So just making sure that we're remembering, the root causes. So since time immemorial, not just on this continent, but others, rape is a tool of conquest, right? Colonizing, the soldiers, the settlers, it's still happening. It's happening in the Ukraine, in, so many places. Just the attitudes towards Native folks, right? Just broader societal norms that devalue anybody who's other, folks with disabilities, the Two-Spirit community, children, folks who are older, anybody who doesn't sort of have a financial reason, they're going to be targeted, right? And those social and political structures that support that. That's what gender-based violence is. So, we've probably all heard the stereotype that we are drunks and drug addicts and we don't care about education or cleaning our yard, right? Like there's all the stereotypes that come with being a Native person. But one thing we know for sure, unequivocally, is that alcohol use is not the cause of sexual violence. So that person's going to be, you know, they're going to have ideas about violence, whether they're drunk or not, or whether they're high or not. And so where this really comes in our advocacy is that I hear it all the time. Well, they were drunk when they did it. You know, they're not like that when they're not drinking. Or, you know, we shouldn't have even been doing the things that we were doing, right? So we'll try to minimize it, but really making sure in our advocacy that we remind them that that's not the cause. They made a decision based on who they are and how they think. And it's about power and control and using that sexual act as violence, right? And we've talked about these other root causes as well quite a bit. I mean, these isms here are just excuses, right? Just excuses to engage in tactics. And more targeted. Okay, so what do we need to know about the public safety portion of it? What do advocates need to know? Is there any questions so far? Anything to add? Because don't be afraid to jump on the mic, or jump in the chat. We can do it. We can do it. We're moving through it. I know this is hard stuff. Okay, so, you know, from people who've been doing this work and looking at things, you know, they've kind of come up with a couple of formulas that kind of always show themselves some patterns, right? And so just a couple of terms to be thinking about, you know, a person who's going to harm others, they already have a predatory nature in them, and it's very planned. I'm sure there are crimes of opportunity, but I just don't believe that people in an instant make a decision and go and sexually assault somebody, no matter who it is or what the circumstances are. I think there is a set of circumstances that has been building for them personally and as a culture, right, that supports that act of violence. And so I think we can't let people off the hook, right? I think that they are very planful, they're manipulators, it's very strategic, they're making choices on who they target, right? And they're going to target somebody who they have access to, who may be vulnerable for whatever reason. What is their credibility of this person? Who's going to believe them? Can I break them down? I mean, somebody had posted it earlier. Oh, Beverly, what is gaslighting? Who wants to share what gaslighting is? Please.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I can share. Yeah, so gaslighting is kind of like, it's difficult to understand, but I guess it's more so like telling somebody that something that actually did happen did not happen, or like it can often manifest, for example, saying, oh, you're crazy, or you must be imagining things, or, you know, you're just being dramatic, or something, like minimizing or trying to outright like deny the reality that something in the past happened.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a tactic that let me see. It's like saying, holy smokes, look at that sky. It's really orange. And you look out the sky and you're like, man, that's like a blue sunny day. There's a few white fluffy clouds going by. And I look at you and say, what? I mean, there's no clouds. That sky is so orange. And you just keep saying it over and over. And then pretty soon you kind of start doubting, like, is it orange? Does it have an orange tint to it? Right? And that's our brain trying to cope with such deep manipulation and misinformation that we may start to doubt ourselves. Yeah. Yeah, reprogramming. Ashley dropped a link in.
I think it's super interesting to where the phrase comes from. It's when we used to actually have like gas lamps, as far as like, you know, Europeans and the way that they lit their streets and the way that they lit their homes. Gaslighting comes from a man originally who was dimming the lights purposefully on his wife to like see if she would notice, and then to willfully tell her that they were not being dimmed to the brink of insanity.
Welcome, Rebecca. Yes, that's a good definition right there, the original definition. Dimming the lights just to see if she'll notice, and then you're like, no way.
Just a little bit. Just take the edge off of the light over time, just a little bit over time, again and again and again. You don't even argue anymore. You're like, of course I'm wrong. Of course I'm stupid. Of course, you know, XYZ, I'm going to believe.
Yeah. And we see it happening every day in the news, right? Look at the things about well, I suppose there's some things I probably should not say, but we do see it every day in the news, okay? That grooming, you know, normalizing it, the testing, right? That grooming process. Yeah, saying racism doesn't exist. Yeah. Abusing that legal process. So the thing about grooming, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later on, but you know, a harm doer will only use as much force or violence as needed, right? So, you know, for my own experience, you know, I only had to be violently hurt a couple of times before I started to comply, right? When I started fighting back and I had to pay the price, at some point you just be like, all right, I give up, right? So I think it's a misunderstanding to think that, you know, terrible violence has happened. It's so nuanced and so gradual that you don't even know what's happening sometimes, right? And so obviously there's many different circumstances the way sexual violence shows up. So, you know, it's just helpful as an advocate to be listening to the person who's sharing information with you. You know, where are the places that you can help make visible the tactics that were used? And I'm not saying like it has to be a checklist or like, see right there, but like what ways can we present the information in a way where the person can be like, holy smokes, I didn't even realize that was happening. Because, you know, we want people to come to their own recognition of things, because that helps strengthen those original principles of advocacy, right? Where we're strengthening their own sovereignty, you know, knowing that they're the experts in their own lives, and we can strengthen that in those kinds of ways. And of course, abusing the legal process, you know, we see that happen all the time, both in instances of, you know, stranger harm and familial harm, right? Okay, we talked about this, I guess. There's a wide range of unwanted sexual activity. Oh, co-occurrence. Yeah, does somebody want to talk about co-occurrence? What they know about co-occurrence? So I can just, you know, add, so co-occurrence could be for sure that something's good is happening at the same time as something bad. Definitely that does happen all the time, right, in violent environments. But co-occurrence is when the harm doer is sort of, let me see an example. Let's see. So if somebody has prior sexual abuse, like they know that their partner was sexually abused as a child, they might use that tactic. So we have, sometimes we have multiple issues, right? It's not just being sexually assaulted. There's a lot of times, a lot of things going on in our lives. We may have been coping by drinking or drug use. We may have some mental health issues. We may have been in violent situations before. So there's a lot of co-occurring things that a predator is going to be really acutely aware of and just be able to notice it like a little freaking light beam. And they're going to target you for that. So I guess it's a tactic. I don't know if that's helpful.
This is Rebecca. Yes, I agree, Christine. And co-occurrence can also be survivor advocate that's dealing with secondary trauma, substance abuse. It could be a child abuse survivor, a domestic violence survivor, and a sexual violence survivor, and sex trafficking, and. So it's just more than one identity while survivors are surviving and advocates are advocating. Because sometimes our families, we are in the middle of the work in our own experiences. So it's like you say, Christine, it's all the things sometimes, right?
Definitely. And the way that shows up from a survivor perspective is I may be getting raped in my relationship, but I'm also getting beat up so badly that I don't even care if I'm getting raped anymore. I just accept it as, I guess this is how it is, right? So again, it's a tactic, a targeted tactic to reinforce submission, reinforce power and control dynamics, reinforce our silence or our inaction, our paralysis. It's really ugly. That's a lot, and it's really ugly. And there's probably other definitions too, but just in this context, that's what we mean.
If I could, Christine, also kind of break down, we have like these building, like it's like Tetris, playing Tetris. If y'all remember that game in the 90s, playing Tetris in our lives. So we have these wheels of what is domestic violence, all the pie chart. What is sexual violence? What is sex trafficking? What is intergenerational trauma? There's a pie chart for learning tools. But even if you choose, if DV is the thing, there's a pie chart. There's co-occurrences all up in that alone. If you look at the sexual violence pie chart, it's all co-occurring. It could be financial abuse and then familial or family isolation. Like that co-occurring thing used to be back in the day, it was mental health and domestic violence or substance abuse and sexual violence. It used to be like cut into big, huge Tetris blocks. But it isn't anymore. It's because we keep growing and evolving and getting stronger and smarter. So I just wanted to break that down that co-occurrence could just be within one facet of surviving. Anyway, thank you, Christine. I appreciate the time.
Yeah. Okay. So, that continuum of sexual violence is, and acts of violence is going to be on a continuum. There's nothing that is better or worse or more or less harmful. It all is harmful, right? But in 2022, with the criminal legal system being prioritized as a way to respond to things, on that continuum, there's going to be certain acts of violence that are attached with a certain law, right? Or a certain level of offense. And so that's going to come into play in our advocacy, kind of understanding that. Right? So we had said earlier that somebody convicted of a sex offense is considered a sex offender, right? So the word offender can be used to refer to the person responsible for perpetrating forced, unwanted sexual activity without implying that arrest has been made or charged, right? And we can get into, trouble with some folks because of language. So this is why we name it. This is why we name it. So your state is going to have your own sort of statutes around predatory offenders. I know in Minnesota, there's been a lot of organizing to take young people off the predatory offender list. Or if somebody's been convicted of a crime that isn't sexual violence related, they can still be on the predatory offender list. So I don't want to go too far into it in this space, but it might be helpful to you to Google what the statute is in your state regarding predatory offenders. It just helps understand some of the legalities around it, and it might be helpful to you in your advocacy. Again, the same principle applies here. In Minnesota, we have 5 degrees of criminal sexual conduct. So your state may have anywhere from 3 to 5. I don't think I've seen more than 5 degrees, but just find out what it is. I probably have a few links that I'll be sending to you, so you'd be able to click on your state to see what your degrees are. And so, for example, the 1st degree is the most severe and most serious offense. And then the 5th degree would be least severe or least serious. So the consideration to determine the level of offense has to do with the age of the harm doer, the age of the victim, the nature of the relationship between the harm doer and the victim, the actual act or factual occurrence that is the basis of the sexual misconduct. So all of those are going to be used in determining the law that was broken. Okay. And so this kind of breaks it down, and it's kind of, stark language, but it's also important for us to just see it written down on a piece of paper to understand it a little bit. So 1st degree, or the most severe, would be felony with sexual penetration with other conditions like the use of a weapon, position of authority, the age of the victim perpetrator, or physical injury. So one of those things have to apply and be when a person reports this crime to a police officer, that's what that police officer is listening for. Was there a use of a weapon? How old? How old were you and was the perpetrator? Was there position authority, right? Was there physical injury? Because they're looking to see if it was a 1st degree crime, right? So that's why it's helpful for us as advocates to kind of know, or just have a little bit of a thing in the back of our head about it. So the 2nd degree would be the same as 1st, but no penetration, right? 3rd degree would be a felony as well, with penetration, and then one of several other conditions. So force without inflicting injury, right? So without inflicting injury, this is why they ask questions, right? They're trying to get at the facts of what happened, because they're trying to determine what level of crime happened. So can you imagine, as somebody who just experienced this and people are asking these questions of you, how jarring it can be and how re-victimizing it can be, right? But we have to understand the institution of law enforcement, that's the information that they're trying to get at. Does that make sense? So, down the line, 4th and 5th degree. So felony is the same with 3rd, but no penetration. And then 5th degree is a non-felony charge, so a misdemeanor. Non-consensual sexual contact of intimate parts. And in your state will likely be somewhat similar. Sometimes it's a little bit different.
Christine, I would just like to jump in and say that it's important to know your tribal court codes too, and if their sexual assault codes are up to date. So, and the jurisdictional stuff. So if you can use your tribal court.
Most definitely. Normally, later in the month, we do a review of codes of a state. We do a review of a federal law, a state law, and a tribal law, just to make a comparison of the text and the way that the information is presented. We won't be able to do that in person, for one, because we're from so many different places in a virtual setting. But, I highly, highly recommend that you just Google what is one federal code, one state code, and one tribal code in your region, and just look at the differences, right? And be thinking about it from the perspective of a police officer reading it. They're looking for what crime was committed. And then from a prosecutor's perspective, they have to make sure that they can see what law was broken, but also the facts that support that that law was broken, right? So now we're kind of getting into a little bit of the system that a survivor or that a victim survivor is going to be encountering and the whys of it. And truly how bad it sucks, right? Yeah, that's the
And as the advocate, we always have to remember that we need to know the system that we're going into with the victim. So make sure you do your background so that you're able to assist the victim when you're going into a system.
Absolutely. Exactly that. Okay. And then the same thing. So your state is going to have their own sex offender registration. Your own tribe will likely have, we'll be talking about that in a second. So, we can be, if you are convicted and required to register, it can be for a minimum of 10 years or sometimes for life. And there is a committee of people who look at the information and make that determination based on a lot of different factors. So there is, discretion. Sometimes there is discretion in when they're making that decision for how long or at what level that the sex offender is going to be listed. So if the same thing in your state, you're going to have public notification laws that may be different. It may be stronger than Minnesota or maybe weaker than Minnesota laws, but it's a good idea to go and look just so you have an idea. And I'll be sending a list of those links so you'll be able to just click on the link. I know it's a lot of information and it's not fun reading, but it's also, we want to be able to do our homework ahead of time. Thomas, it was shared in the chat. Afton, if you're still with us, maybe you can drop it in the chat again. That'd be awesome. Otherwise, the PowerPoint will be in that link that I'll send you tonight of the recording. So you'll have access to all of it. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, even knowing like who in your state is the one who's making these decisions. That's something that might even be helpful to know. Anytime we can provide information about the system that a victim is going to be engaging in, it helps to have a little bit more information. So here in Minnesota, if they fail to register, it's additional 5 years. For first-time convictions, it could be a year and a day. If they fail to register, it could be a 2-year prison sentence, and then it's going to start over, right? Whatever their requirement is, it will start over. So that's good to know too, right? And we also know that just because you were convicted or put on a sex offender registry list, that doesn't mean we know who our harm doers are, right? Because we know of all the statistics about who that we don't report and all the things, right? But it is also helpful information to know that at least somebody is trying to institutionalize this information to get a shared. So going into like a relationship with the state and even at a federal level, so a perpetrator can't just move to another reservation or another state and keep causing harm, right? Like, can we get them all in a database so we can track it better? And it's not a fail-proof system, but it's better than not knowing at all. Right? So when the Adam Walsh Act, when Adam Walsh, the man who lost his son, to violence, like we did a lot of organizing, got on TV, he's just done some incredible organizing, right? And the Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act, or SORNA, got passed in 2006. And so that was that national or a federal level tracking system. But what happened is that they didn't allocate money. So remember on that thing about the boarding schools that the Congress allocated $10,000 to assimilate us back in 1819. But then, by 1851, they had set aside $3 million to assimilate us, right? So it's the same kind of thing. They passed this law in 2006, but they didn't put any money towards it. So people couldn't get the software that they needed or hire the staff to be able to keep up with the database. So it has not been, 100% foolproof, but it's also, moving towards a standard that is better than not knowing at all. And I know Rebecca typed some about PL 280, but we'll be talking about PL 280 across the month. It's a complicated jurisdictional maze, and I don't want to go too deep into it at this moment because we'll be talking more about it next week. But we're trying to get better. The tribes have to opt in to say they're going to be a part of this system, and then they have to hire the staff, buy the software to be able to go into the computer and type people's names in, right? That's really what it boils down to. And I guess the last time we updated this slide was last year. So 186 jurisdictions have complied, 22 states, 160 tribes and 4 territories. And we can get you this link too, so you can see, where your state or where your tribe is. So that assessment of risk. So we have in Minnesota an independent risk assessment. It's a test, basically. I have it printed out, but I don't know where it went. But they have a standardized set of questions. And I suppose somebody could go in and decolonize those sets of questions, but at least it's there, it's out there. You can Google it and find what it is in your state. But they're looking for those risk factors for reoffending. So looking at the sexual preferences, any compulsivity, the types of sexualized violence that was used, but they're also looking at the support system that comes with familial support, jobs, places to live, transportation, all the things, right? They'll usually be assigned a person who checks in with them, especially if they're to a level where they shouldn't have technology. So sometimes in order to pay their bills, they have to be with somebody at a computer and pay their bills so they can be observed, so they're not using technology to cause harm, like that kind of stuff. And that can be mandated in your, in your conditions. And some of those risk factors, again, I guess we just talked about this: poor coping skills, a history of offenses, even non-sexual criminal history can be a risk factor. Emotional congruence with children, high degree of impulsivity. So, as you can see, all of these things are really, some of them are very measurable. It either is or it isn't. But some things are not as easily measurable. Like, who gets to decide what a high degree of impulsivity is, right? So there's a constant need for evaluation of these, of any kind of program or system that we're putting into place, right? If they're attracted to things other than human beings, that's a factor. Male target pedophilia is a factor for reoffending. And then access to victims. So you'll see in the news that they'll release a statement that says you can't be within 100 yards of a school, or that kind of stuff. It'll be written right in your conditions, right on the poster that gets posted. So this is kind of getting into, the culture of violence that we're in, right? Those pro-offending beliefs, like who has the power and privilege, right? Who should be subservient? Is it written in the Bible for certain, things to happen? That kind of stuff, right? There's a belief and value system that makes a risk factor. Prior victimization as a male, being young. Right? So Harrison Hansen, the studies, and this is a pretty old statistic, but most likely to reoffend would be pedophiles who molest boys. rapists of adult women, 39%, child molesters, and repeat offenders are more likely to offend. There's some studies out there that say that harm doers can have like upwards of 60 victims. I don't know how many or who, but that's a pretty startling statistic. So from a treatment perspective, and a mainstream idea of treatment is that they would take responsibility for their behavior, right? They would be in a setting that they would take responsibility for it with others and try to make amends, right? So understanding their patterns of criminal behavior, looking at relapse prevention, or developing skills. So if you go back to those reoffending risk factors, the treatment would be set up to try to help with those risk factors. Like, do they have a place to live? Do they have income? You know, all that kind of like sort of base support, right, will help in the, you know, hopefully for a person to not reoffend. Changing attitudes and thinking, right? Acquiring skills and behavior to be back in community. Knowing that it's a choice, that they're making a choice, because a lot of people who cause harm will say, I couldn't help myself, or they'll use all the other excuses. But really, if a person wants to change, they will work towards what it looks like to have self-control over their choices, and they'll own it. Right? So are they amendable to treatment? Can they be managed safely in community? What does that look like? You know, knowing that not all sex offenders will stop, right? And even if they've gone through the treatment or done the work, it doesn't necessarily mean they're never going to cause harm again. And in our advocacy, we would take that into account. Inadequate treatment is not better than no treatment, because if somebody is going to support pro-offending beliefs or give them better tactics, that's not going to be helpful to the people, right? So cognitive behavior techniques could be used. And so this is where they're in a group with each other, which the statistics say is better because they can call each other on their BS. I don't know. I've not been in those spaces. So in Minnesota, once the clients have completed their prison sentence, they've been civilly committed, they can be placed in treatment for an indeterminate time. A civil court can convict them, right? If the judge determines them to be psychopathic personality or sexually dangerous. Your state may be a little bit different. You can check into it. You can advocate for it. Breathing. We're so close. We're so close. I find it so interesting that so many rules are attached to sex offenders upon release, and communities don't want to live by them. But when someone says they are a victim, people don't believe it. Ashley, right? Like, somebody's causing all this harm. What's that about? Yes. That is so incongruent. Yes. How often do sex offenders get treatment in Minnesota, court ordered? I don't know the number, Victoria. I knew at one time, but this was like 10 years ago. And I don't even remember the number even remotely. We could Google it though. Anybody interested in Googling that information? How many sex offenders get treatment in Minnesota? Or court-ordered treatment? Because I'm curious too. Okay, so that's a lot. And now we're going to do some tactics. Is there a walk-in treatment for this? Like, people have offended but never charged. There's none that I know of locally, but I do know that some tribal nations have set up responses in their community that is more, I guess the technical term would be like a restorative justice model, where they've used elders and ceremony. So, you know, there's some tribal models out there, but I don't know of any in Minnesota.
So I looked up the stats for Minnesota sex offender program stats. It says that total clients agreed upon discharge by court 59, 35 currently living in communities, fewer than 10 are awaiting placement. And it says that there are 437. Okay, I'm not sure on that. Hold on. Okay, so it's not saying it's exactly, it's just saying total number granted discharge by court is 59 and 35 are living in communities.
And that link that this is Becky, Afton and I both shared, you can, if I mean, it's Minnesota specific, but you can dig more into the data there if you would like.
If you looked at your Department of Human Services website in your state, or, you know, your tribe might have statistics too. So it's, you know, those are places that you can look if you wanted to know your own information. Andrea, Hollow Water, y'all should watch the video for Hollow Water. It's pretty profound. It's a community in Canada that basically combined the criminal justice system with their own tribal justice. So they got the judge and the prosecutor and the defense attorney and the police department, right, to agree to be in a circle together and put the harm doer in the circle and use both processes. So both a legal process, but also a community-driven process to basically say the harm that you did, this is how it has impacted me. This is how it has impacted our community. So a much more traditional approach. And some people want that and some people don't. But I think the reality is that a lot of times we are taught that the criminal justice path is the only path to get justice, right? But when we're thinking about our own practices, but thinking about our own wounds and what we're trying to recover as a people, some spaces for restorative justice, or call it what you want to call it in English words, but to restore our community in that way could have profoundly healing, beautiful impacts, right? Mary, the outcomes, the rates did go down. They couldn't sustain it. I think oppression is like that. If you don't have a group of committed people to keep maintaining it and keep deepening the practices around it, it can be, the window is too small. Yeah, but it's possible. Right? All right. It's a very intense and deep conversation that you would need readiness, you would need community readiness for to engage in it. Okay, so tactics, what do we need to know? And we talked about grooming a little bit. So the Undetected Rapist is a study or a paper that was written in Boston, I believe. And so they asked people who were convicted of rape, you know, what did they look for? Why did they do it? How did they do it? And so it was basically a survey of people who were convicted of rape. And so what they found and what the answers were is that they were looking for vulnerable victims. So whatever that looks like, you know, to be lonely or insecure, prior survivors, to be non-assertive. They planned the attacks, right? They only used the necessary amount of violence to control the situation. They used psychological weapons like power, control, manipulation, and threats, using substances to render them vulnerable to the attack, using marriage or intimate partner violence as an excuse, right? And then, of course, isolation. It's a tried and true tactic, is to isolate. So not only physical isolation, but the manipulation of the games that people play with somebody's mind to say, you know, Well, I'm sure we could come up with some scenarios of that mental manipulation and tactics of isolation, right? They don't even like you, or they were talking crap about you. Or, I heard this.
Christine, I don't know. I know this is going to be addressed, if I could, in another session, another module. But I wanted to add in this early part of this time together, and I've heard it, and I'm sure many of you may have heard it. Tukashila said, Creator said, and we began like, you're special. You're supposed to be this part of the altar by doing this and that and the other. And that goes all the way to the game of urban, like, I'm going to hook you up. You're going to become a model. I'm going to get you in a music video. All the things become relevant when it becomes to undetected abusers. They will use every tactic. So I just wanted to like chime in with that. Thank you.
But somebody was talking earlier about the activist, right? Like in activist circles, how it's another place where that grooming is happening, right? Yes, very much. Then we have the whole online thing, which is a huge part of our lives now, particularly, coming out of a pandemic or being smack in the middle of it. I don't know where we're at, but our online presence is terrifying. Like, it's everywhere, it's constant, it's consistent, it's growing. And of course, it's ever changing and evolving. And so, as fast as we can come up with protections or, some way to mitigate the harm that's caused, people are coming up with new ways and figuring it out, right? But some of those tactics can just be building that relationship, building that trust, right? Which it's lies, but it's building that trust. Lying about age or attributes, or that flattery, that sympathy, right? That goes on to getting personal information or looking at their social media to find out where they are, right? And then it kind of always escalates too. So it's only going to escalate as far as it has to for the harm doer to get what they want, right? So if they don't have to use fear and blackmail and intimidation to get what they want, they won't. But then there will come a time when they may have to step it up, right? Step up the violent tactics. And so that grooming process is much the same online, in those virtual spaces as it is in real life with human beings, right? All the way to blackmail and threats of violence, and not just threats, right? Sometimes there's acts of violence. They'll send you a picture of your sister or your dog or your mom, right? Like, it's real, very real. So if we're thinking about targeting and recruitment of child victims, so there's, that slide before about it's very strategic, very manipulative and very strategic, right? Planful. So working or living where children are accessible, targeting single mothers, right? Especially with one child, like if it's just one child in the family, they can be, because they don't have another human being in the room, as a witness, so they can be particularly targeted. So identifying and targeting weaknesses, in personality or life circumstances. Sometimes, gosh, my mom she was going to school full time and working 2 jobs just to try to make it, right? And so a family like that can be targeted for violence because they know they're going to have a lot of access, right? They know they're going to have vulnerability. They know that they can interrupt credibility, right? Oh, they're lying. I would never do that, because nobody was there to witness, to attest to that violence. Even with our cultural ways and that spiritual hunger, that can definitely be a targeted weakness, because of all the things we were talking about earlier, to not have access to our language and ritual and practice, our medicines. If somebody does have that information, they can definitely weaponize it, right? Identifying if the child is needy, so that could just be just plain hungry. Our kids can be hungry, right? or just want what all kids want. They want the cute clothes or the nice shoes, the nice tennies. Everybody wants the phone, right? So anytime that they can capitalize on, something that is a need for the child, they're going to target that and manipulate it, right? Youth shelters, after school programs. And building that trust, right? That grooming process is very much alive and well and all that. And so we kind of already talked about this, but with kids, it's convincing them that they're special, using secrecy and isolation, but it's also about testing, right? I don't know what else to call it, but to see how far that they can go with the accidental touching, like the accidental touching, to see what the response will be from the child or from the people around. So that happens right in front of the whole family sometimes, because that harm doer is testing to see what the response will be from the family or at the school or at the baseball game or wherever the environment is. They're testing the environment and they're testing the child. They're testing the response around them. Tickling, that kind of stuff, wrestling around, right? So those are all kind of red flags to be kind of looking for, being conscious of. One of the things that's like so important is kind of changing that culture around respecting our elders. Like in Native community, we respect our elders and we know that, but also we have to listen to the child and restore their bodily autonomy and respect their little sovereign bodies. With my niece and nephew, if you ask me to cut open my chest and give you my heart, I would for them. And when I don't get to see them for a long time, I just want to just like squeeze them and love them up. But I can't. When I see them, I have to ask for permission for hugs or kisses, right? Because I want to honor their little body sovereignty. Because if I don't, or I model for them that their sovereignty, body sovereignty doesn't matter, I'm teaching them that anybody can do that, right? And so it's not their fault or their responsibility to teach, to learn that. It's our responsibility as the adults in their life to teach them that their body matters, right? Because it will help with disclosures or all the things. And we'll talk more about that, but just really, really super important to, if they don't want to go give hugs and kisses or whatever to somebody, don't make them do that, right? Because the harm doer is looking for those cues. Mark my words, they're looking for those social cues of whether somebody's going to say something or not, okay? And then kind of what Rebecca was just talking about, Takashila said, or creator said, assuring the rightness of the act, all the way to threats, bribes, punishment, physical assault, alienation, all of those things, that progression, right? Using only as much harm or as violence as necessary to keep control. So this is a video about grooming that I'll just share the link in the chat because I want to stop and see if there's any questions. It's 4:18. Got about 12 minutes left. I would rather just like have you, if you're interested in watching this or using this as a tool, if somebody wanted to understand the grooming, the digital age grooming tactics, it's a useful video to watch. But I want to open it up for us to talk it out. How are we doing? Hi, Shayla. Nice to see your face.
Hi.
So what questions or what are we sitting with? Little body sovereignty. I was asked to do, some social workers asked me to do a training on child sexual abuse to talk about my abuse or my journey or whatever. And one of the social workers asked me, I'm working with, I think she was 6 or something at the time. And she said, what can I tell the 6-year-old that I'm working with to stop them from getting sexually abused? And it just like hit me like a punch in my throat, right? Like to think that a child can prevent their own sexual abuse, it's just like mind blowing to me. Like they can't prevent that, right? And so what are the ways that and on the same hand, what are the ways that we can build a sense of self and purpose and place in a child? And that body sovereignty does matter, and just modeling it for them every day, everywhere. And I don't know, people might have seen it. I think it came out on Facebook a few years ago where there was a dad was teasing the granddaughter, and the mom was like getting more and more upset because the dad wouldn't stop teasing the granddaughter. And finally, the mom was able to stand up and say, stop. Right. And so in that moment, she modeled what it was like to stand up and say no. So there's like so many nuanced ways, like a child cannot prevent their own harm, but also at the same time, we have to model what it is to stand up and say something, because we're showing that they do have sovereignty, body sovereignty. Yeah. Okay, Beverly's asking, has anybody been faced with law enforcement not cooperating with someone that reports an incident and then just brushes them off? Yeah, I have as well. Does anybody want to respond to Beverly? This is where advocacy can really come in, is having an advocate step in and make those phone calls or go show up. It's a member of law enforcement that's at fault. Yeah. So going right in, like we're talking to the person who was supposed to take that information down, reporting them to their supervisor. We don't know all the details, so it's hard to say, but those are some things on the top of my head that I think that could be helpful from an advocate perspective.
And sometimes during the reporting process, if someone's under the influence, whether recreational, prescribed, or whatever it may be, a lot of law enforcement will defer from the actual problem and focus on their current state. And it's outside of a medical perspective, but rather a place of judgment, and not making assumptions that they're an imperfect witness, and would rather put them in a temporary detox or hold them within some time. And then the assault becomes on the back burner, hopefully, or hoping that when they come to, that it won't be a concern anymore. That's something I've experienced in advocacy before.
I can jump into that. We had it to the point where there was an officer where we learned his schedule just so that no victims would ever be brought in during his time, because no matter what we did going to his superiors or even above that and going through, like, I'm in Wisconsin, so the Wisconsin Department of Justice, things just weren't really getting done, and he wouldn't change his attitude. So we just tried to do our best to make sure that survivors didn't have to face that, like, ever.
That's a very beautiful demonstration of like standing outside the system. Like sometimes the reality is that our institutions are so deeply ingrained. Like we would never give up trying to change the institutions, and we have to do things for our safety in the moment, right? Like in the now. And that's awesome and creative. And we do that with our relatives too. You know, we'll say, you know, you better come to town with me because I don't want you home alone with uncle or whatever, right? Like we have our ways of being creative to protect each other. And so it shows up all kinds of ways. Mary, do you want to, I see your hand there?
Yeah, I work at a college, and we had an incident with our campus police where somebody was sexually assaulted in a restroom who was autistic. And then so the police arrived on the scene because the staff you know, called the campus police, and because the person was autistic, they assumed they were drunk and handcuffed them and interrogated them in front of the library building publicly, like terrified this individual who then wasn't on campus for months, you know, because of the trauma. So, you know, just kind of uplifting the comments about alcohol and the judgment around that, and how that also kind of intersects with disability and ableism.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Summer, I see your hand raised as well.
Yeah, I had a disabled woman that was getting abused by her live-in daughter. And I had called the cops, and the cops did nothing. They let her live there because she was getting mail there. Legally, she was okay to be there. So I had to leave. And then the next day we went to the Golden House, and they helped us write up a whole thing about, then she got a, what is that called? Where you get like she can't be by you.
Order for protection or a.
Yeah.
Stay away.
Like yeah, so then she was able to leave, but we had to jump through like 3 hoops, go to down to the court, put that in. It was just a lot.
That's a lot. That's advocacy, stellar advocacy right there.
But I got her out.
Like jumping through the hoops, and if as many hoops as we can jump through on their behalf, that's helpful. So there's a balance between establishing their autonomy, right? Like supporting their autonomy to make decisions as experts in their own lives. And when it comes to things like hoop jumping, right? That's not helpful as a survivor to have to hoop jump. So as advocates, if we can do some of the hoop jumping so they can get to the real decisions, that's where we want to go with our advocacy. Yeah, it's awesome. What else? Wow, folks, we got through day 2. Day 2 with 2 minutes to spare. What's up? Well, hi Beverly. I just love seeing people's faces because I know it's hard to keep the camera on all the time, but it makes me so happy to see faces. I appreciate it. But you know, the day was long and complex and sometimes painful and ugly to hear all that truth and harm. So, you know, I just want you to take into consideration that things are, you know, you heard today from a couple of these folks how beautiful things are and how creative we can be as advocates. It's not all bad. We'd have to keep working, you know, for the people and do it with love and do the best we can. Just do our very best every day. Get the support that we possibly can to support people who are experiencing that violence in the moment. Right? So take good care of yourselves tonight. We'll be off now until next Tuesday. We'll be back on Tuesday, July 12th, and it should be modules 4. So we'll be doing, next Tuesday, we'll be doing social change advocacy, the sexual harassment module, which is of course a legal requirement, you know, sexual harassment, we have to talk about that. And then policies and procedures. So policies and procedures in your own organization. What does it look like to advocate for change? Like we were talking, I don't know if we were talking after debrief last time or as a staff, but like what does it look like to, if you can't burn sage at the organization, what does it look like to change our own policies within our own organization, right? We should be able to do that. So like that kind of stuff, we'll be talking about that. Okay, and then of course I'll drop this recording and all of the PowerPoints and the links to the videos that we watched. You can put some of the links that folks dropped in the chat. We'll make sure, and I'll just put that in the document so you can just click on it and look at it when you can. Hi, Stephanie. All right, and we'll stay on. We'll shut the recording off here in a little second, and then we'll stay on if people have any questions or comments that they don't want on the recording. All right, so thank you all so much. Miigwech, Bizendawiye, miigwech for listening to us. And thank you for your insight and sharing all the beautiful knowledge that you all have. It's incredible. It makes my heart so happy. And to our interpreters, Hercules with his short hair, and to our staff for checking out that chat room. Thank you so much. And we'll see y'all on Tuesday the 12th, okay? I'm going to stop the recording.